All right, we will get started for the sake of time today. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Thank you for joining us and spending your lunch break with us today. My name is Mindy Hunthrop, and most of you who've attended a webinar before know that I am the program manager for the Operations Management degree program here at the University of Arkansas. So just as a reminder, this webinar series is hosted by the 3 online degree programs that you see on your screen now. So we do offer online degrees in engineering, engineering management, and operations management. So to get us started today, I will introduce to you today's presenter, Dr. Ed Pohl. He is a professor who's holding the 21st Century Professorship in Engineering. He's also the Industrial Engineering Department Head at the University of Arkansas. He actually previously served as the director of the Master of Science in Operations Management online degree program. He has participated in and led several risk and supply chain related research efforts here at the university. And before coming to the U of A, Dr. Pohl spent 21 years in the U.S. Air Force, where he served in a variety of engineering, operations analysts, and academic positions during his career. He received his PhD in Systems and Industrial Engineering from the University of Arizona. He also holds 3 master's degrees, one an MS in Systems Engineering from the Air Force Institute of Technology, an MS in Reliability Engineering from the University of Arizona, and an MS in Engineering Management from the University of Dayton. He also has a BS in Electrical Engineering from Boston University. He has received numerous honors and awards, including multiple outstanding teaching awards that are selected by students, outstanding research awards, and alumni awards. He also became an elected fellow of the Institute of Industrial Engineering in 2014, and he held the John L. Imhoff Chair in the Department of Industrial Engineering here at the University of Arkansas in 2014 and 2015. So with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Dr. Ed Pohl, who is your presenter today.
All right. Thank you, Mindy. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon seminar. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about supply chain risk management and why it's becoming a more important topic in today's environment. All right, so here's a brief outline of what I'm going to do. First, I'll start with some motivation. Why is there a sudden interest in supply chain risk? We'll talk about the need for it. We're going to talk about what risk is, and then specifically, how do we manage that risk within a supply chain? And then I'll talk a little bit briefly about what the future holds, and in particular, I'll spend a few minutes talking about blockchain and where it fits in helping us in the supply chain risk arena as we move forward in the future. So why the sudden interest is a collection of recent books that I have on my shelf that came out starting in 2015 up to 2018, and you can see there's a lot of interest in supply chain risk management, trying to understand and strategize for how to reduce risk so that companies can operate efficiently and effectively and become more resilient to what seems to be more frequent supply chain disruptions. A lot of what I'm talking about today comes out of the book over here by Schlegel and Trent. That's my main primary source for today's presentation. So chain disruptions are in the news all the time. A lot of them are environmentally related. Several of them are terrorism related. Some are just natural disasters. Some are employee driven. You know, strikes at the shipyard has a significant impact on the supply chain. I think this is from in Japan when they had the tsunami. This is the Walmart trucks going into New Orleans due to Hurricane Katrina. This is alluding to the post office disruption when they found anthrax in the postal system. So there's a variety of reasons and ways that supply chains can be disrupted, and we seem to be seeing more and more today, especially driven by environmental factors. And why are people taking notice of this? Well, supply chain failures are expensive. So, and these are just a few. One of the interesting ones is the cell phone between Ericsson and Nokia. So Ericsson had a problem with their supply chain where it was disrupted due to a fire. They had a fire from one of their key suppliers, and they weren't able to handle the demand because their supply chain was basically cut off for a period of time until they could get a second source of their supplier. And that particular incident cost them more than $400 million in losses. And then they also lost a significant market share as a result. So that can really have an impact on your business if you don't plan for and come up with strategies on how you might handle potential disruptions. So you have to look at that as part of your strategy when we talk about supply chain management and supply chain risk. Recalls, we've all heard about the different types of recalls. Recalls can be for a variety of reasons, but anytime you have a recall, it impacts your supply chain. Mattel had 19 million toys recalled. It cost them $30 million. And then the other issue is if your supply chain is ineffective for a variety of reasons, maybe a manufacturer for one of your drugs has some issues and the quality is not where it needs to be. So now there's a shortage of drugs, or there was in China the heparin scare. There in China they had a disease outbreak related to the pigs, the sows that are used to make the drug heparin. So it really put a scare into the heparin supply chain and basically began to dry up the availability of heparin, which had a huge impact in the healthcare arena because heparin is a blood thinner which is used for surgery. So you can see there's significant potential for impact depending on what items you're selling or working with that are critical to your supply chain. So this is just a chart that shows you the cost of critical care medicines and what the impact of low supplies are on them. So, number of drugs in short supply, hospitals that have 1 to 5 drugs is 6%. But what's interesting is down here, hospitals that have 21 or more drugs that are in short supply is 44%. So again, not working your supply chain efficiently or allowing it to be disrupted can have significant impacts, especially in the healthcare sector over here. And these are some of the impacts that you could have. The patient treatment gets delayed. So if you don't have heparin, you might not be able to do the surgery this week. You might have to wait another week. They might get a less effective drug, so it may impact their ongoing treatment. They may not get treatment. And then on the downside is they may experience an adverse outcome because the drugs that were needed were not available. So these are just a few examples where you can see that the cost, both in dollars and impact on life, can be significant due to failures in the supply chain. This kind of gives you a picture of the financial impact on basically the stock price for a company that undergoes a major supply chain issue. And this comes from a paper out of the Journal of Operations Management, where they were looking at the effect of supply chain glitches on shareholder wealth. And you can see, we know shareholder wealth is a function of cash flows, and then there's the intangibles, credibility and reputation. And so anytime you have a supply chain problem or a recall or anything in those areas, it affects the intangibles. But your supply chain strategy, your operational metrics impact how efficient, reliable, and responsive your supply chain is to changes or disruptions. So it's important that you have a good strategy for how to deal with the risks that might be relevant for your particular supply chain and how you handle them. And over here in this particular chart, it shows you a graph of the average shareholder returns as a function of how long it was, how many days till the announcement of a supply chain event, right? So supply chain glitch to 60 days of trading after the announcement of a glitch. So immediately you can see it can have a drop of 10%, and over time it may even go down as low as 12%. So from a corporate perspective and a shareholder wealth, shareholder value perspective, it can have a significant impact. So why the sudden increase in intensity? Well, the world's become more complicated. The world's become more dependent on each other, primarily due to the fact that we've become highly connected. The advances made in the internet, the advances that are being made today with the Internet of Things, really make us a dependent and globally dependent supply chain. And so weather events, not only here in the U.S., but weather events in Asia, in Africa, other places in the world where we might be drawing supplies or raw materials from, can have a significant impact on our own markets here, because we're dependent on some of those raw materials for some of the key elements of our products that we're developing. So because we're so dependent and connected, we've become more likely to be impacted by significant events around the world. So on this chart, I want to talk about some of the trends that have been going on in supply chain, and then we're going to talk about what the consequences of those trends are. So one of the big trends in the late 90s, early 2000s was the notion of just-in-time and lean, right? Everybody wanted to make their supply chains as efficient as possible, make them lean. They didn't want to have product, a whole lot of inventory. They didn't want to have work in process in the manufacturing facilities. So they were trying to be as efficient as possible. But that efficiency comes at a price. That's great as long as everybody in the supply chain is providing things when they're needed. But if there's a disruption, it can have a significant impact on the effectiveness, right? So when do you become too lean, right? That you're increasing your risk to potential disruptions, which can have longer term and maybe more costly effects on your business than maybe holding a little more inventory or having multiple suppliers as opposed to single suppliers. There's been a push to reduce cost, and in order to do that, a lot of companies have really engaged in creating their global supply chain, because to take advantage of the lower cost materials and lower cost labor markets around the world. So they've made their supply chain more complex and longer, right? But when they did that, they also made the complexity increases their potential vulnerability to disruptions in a broader scale. Again, economies of scale. A lot of companies want to centralize manufacturing and distribution, which creates less flexibility, and consolidation of suppliers creates single points of failure. So if your only supplier for your wafers is coming out of Japan, and they're impacted by the tsunami over there, you might have to shut down production until you can find a second source, which could take you a while. So again, being susceptible to single point of failure by doing too much consolidation of suppliers can have a negative consequence. And then the other one is a lot of businesses started outsourcing their non-core business activities. For example, a company that develops a product may outsource their transportation, may outsource a variety of other activities that are part of their supply chain. And what that does is that creates the potential for loss of control. So that's added to the impact of increasing risk. This is just an example of a study that I did with one of my PhD students, where we were looking at how do we locate distribution centers to deal with our major companies. And classically, what you want to do is we use something called the P-center problem, where we want to locate our facilities to minimize the distance from our customer to its closest DC. So in this case, for the sample problem here, we located 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 15 DCs to a set of, I think, 30 or 35 customers. And the max distance anybody was from a particular DC was 294. Now let's suppose something happens where we'll take a blizzard in this part of the country, and we lose 3 DCs. Well, if we lose those 3 DCs for a period of a week due to a disruption, now the max distance for folks increases substantially, so it has a significant impact. So maybe what you need to start thinking about is, hey, maybe we ought to locate for more than just efficiency, but maybe think about locating and considering vulnerability. So maybe we want to locate our facilities amongst a set of locations in order to minimize the maximum distance from a demand point to our closest facility, whether that's its second or third closest facility, to make it more robust to potential losses or changes from one particular place being disrupted. And this just gives you an example of what we do. Now, there's a price to doing that, and you can see over here when we did it, our max distance increases, but we're now robust. If we take three DCs out, and in this case the worst three, the max distance is 718, so it's a drop of 33% from what it was before. So maybe these are some things we need to think about now, is rather than just focusing on efficiency, we may need to think about risk and vulnerability. So Deloitte did a survey, and I think this was back in 2008, 2009, of 600 executives at manufacturing and retail companies. So they found that 63% were concerned about risks within the extended supply chain that comprised both vendors and customers, and it was ranked among their top 2 concerns. And why? Well, one of the reasons is that they have no control over some of the causes, or they feel like they don't have control over many of the causes. They do have control over how they deal with the consequences. So a lot of events are driven due to things like globalization, offshoring, and outsource. So you may have a localized event, but it can have a global consequence on the performance of your supply chain. So that's creating some concern and consternation among the leaders in manufacturing and retail companies. So when we talk about risk, what is risk? And this is the actual definition that comes out of Schlegel and Trent. And they define risk as the probability of realizing an unintended consequence that leads to an unintended outcome, such as loss, injury, harm, or missed opportunity. So it's the probability of realizing an unintended consequence. And a lot of organizations will use this red, green, yellow chart, where you have the likelihood of an event going from low likelihood to high likelihood, and the severity of an event from low severity to high severity. And these are the ones that you want to avoid. You want to avoid the high severity and high likelihood events, right? These can create problems for you. You want to be down here where you have low likelihood events with small severity impact. So ideally, you want to keep yourself in the green. And if you're in the yellow, you need to start to think about what can we do to mitigate, maybe mitigate so that we're resilient to that risk if it occurs, or find ways to change our system to move us back into the green. If you're in the red, those are situations that could create significant problems for you. So this is a tool that a lot of organizations will do to assess the various risks that they face. It's a trade-off or an analysis where you look at the likelihood of an event and then the consequence associated with that event should it occur. We're going to talk about a few risk concepts. The first is an event, what it means, what an event is. We'll talk about risk exposure. Kind of the new buzzword today that everybody's using is the term resilience. You want your supply chain to be resilient. So we'll talk about what that means and explain that. We'll talk about the analysis or assessment techniques for risk, the need for response plan, and then the other concept is compliance and the risk of failing to comply. So risk events, again, this goes back to the earlier chart that I had at the beginning. There are a large variety of events that have occurred over the last 10 years that impact our supply chains. You know, this is we have earthquakes, we have terrorists, this is a fire, this is a hurricane, and then just regular snowstorms, regular accidents. You know, you might have a train derail that has a large amount of product on it, or it may cause a disruption for a day or two or a week for a variety of products. So those are what are events. They're events that happen that cause your normal operation of your supply chain to be disrupted. one of the terms that's often used when they talk about risk is what's our risk exposure? And this is an example that comes from Dr. Simke Levy's materials at MIT. And he uses a high-tech manufacturer's as an example, and he shows you how you can assess the risk exposure for a particular high-tech manufacturer. So what you do is you look at all of the elements of your extended supply chain. So you've got your stores and distributors, you got your assembly plants where you're getting your manufactured material. You've got contract manufacturers, U.S. suppliers, distributors, stuff coming in from overseas through U.S. ports. And then you send it out to stores or to distributors using truckload or less than truckload type services. And what you need to do is you need to look at what happens if we have an event way back here at tier 2 or higher in our supply chain, and we have an event that says the time to recovery is 2 weeks back here. If we have a 2-week recovery period, it could have a financial impact at this stage of $300 million. So your printed circuit board folks might have a 2-week delay of something coming into here might have a financial impact of $300 million. Your chipset manufacturer 2-week delay may have a $400 million impact. The 2 weeks delay on your contract manufacturers who are taking all of that material and integrating it could be as high as $2.5 billion. So that's a significant exposure. Down here, that 2-week delay may only affect your local U.S. suppliers at an impact rate of $400 million. Your ports, the 2-week delay has a cost with both the ports and the distributors, as well as the assembly plants. The assembly plant is 1.5. This risk exposure index is the maximum financial impact over all nodes in your supply chain. So in this particular example, your risk exposure index would be 2.5 billion because it's the largest of the financial impacts across the elements of your supply chain. So that's a way people can assess what the impact would be for different types of scenarios where they look at a variety of risks. As I said earlier, the term resilience has, with regards to supply chain, has really gained a lot of momentum. This comes out of an article by Yossi Sheffi and James Rice that was in the MIT Sloan Management Review back in 2005. And when we talk about resilience, we talk about we have a system that's performing at some particular level, and then there's some disrupted event, and that disruption causes our system's performance to degrade. And then after some period of time, hopefully we begin to react, and when we do that, the system may recover. But it may or may not recover back to its original level of performance. And so one of the things you need to do in order to be resilient is you need to prepare up front and assess what the potential risks are. And that's what supply chain risk management is all about, is doing this preparation part so that you can improve the efficiency of the recovery part multiple ways. One, reduce the extent at which you may drop, and two, reduce the extent in terms of how long it takes to recover. And so supply chain risk management will help you begin to look and address those issues early on in your organization. And what drives this is what the risk appetite is for a particular company. You're trading off risk and reward, right? There's a balancing act here where you have to trade off how much risk am I willing to take so that I get a particular reward. So if I want to be really efficient and keep my costs really low, I might have a single source supplier because, hey, they're doing well, they're able to meet my demands, their price is right. But if something happens to them, even though the reward all along is good, if something happens, right, there's a risk that something might happen where that particular supplier gets disrupted, then there could be a significant cost or outcome associated with that. So you have to balance those risks and rewards. And companies have different levels of risk that they're willing to tolerate, right? So we can have people who are risk takers or gamblers, right? And then we have those who are risk avoiders who really want to reduce the level of risk and guard against those significant and severe consequences. So as a company, you have to define what your tolerance for risk is, and that's really important. So this is an overview chart of what a risk assessment process would look like. I'm going to talk to it real quickly at a very high level. First, you have to understand the organizational objectives, both the internal and external environment that are at play with your organization. Then you need to find, recognize, and describe the risks. What are the risks that are related to your organization? You should be able to write a risk statement that includes sources, events, causes, and consequences for each of the risks that you're interested in following and managing. Then once you've identified those risks, you really have to spend some time trying to understand what the nature of the risk is. And then in order to be able to make trades, you have to understand what the level of risk is. So you determine the risk's potential impact, i.e. what are the consequences, and then how likely it is. So that's the analysis part where you spend time doing that. And then once you have all your set of risks together, you compare the result of the analysis with the risk to determine whether the risk is acceptable. Is the company willing to accept that risk, or are we going to spend some time, money, and effort to try and mitigate or reduce that risk? And then after they evaluated it, you modify the risk by mitigating, avoiding, or transferring it, or accepting it. And then over time, you continue to monitor or report. Things may change in your supply chain or your organization that causes certain risks to increase or decrease. And as those things do change, you should continue to communicate. And you may repeat this process as the environment changes and as time changes within the organization. So that's the risk assessment process. In addition to having an assessment process, you should also have a response plan. So for each of those risks you identify, you ought to be thinking about and planning for how do we respond when an incident occurs, right? So there should be some notion of exercises and training related to preparedness, response, recovery associated with your particular risks that you're interested in. And so having a plan that takes you from incident to return to pre-incident operations is something all organizations should have for their high risks. The other item on when we talk about risk is this notion of compliance risk, and Trent and Schlegel define compliance risk as the process that actually records and monitors the daily business activities to make sure that the company is complying with law, industry mandates, or internal policies. So there can be some compliance risks associated with, and this is an example over here of a fake drug. So you have an authentic drug over here on the left. You have a counterfeit drug over here on the right. And how can you tell? Well, they can do some sort of imagery test, and they can see that the makeup of the fake drug, which is the blue line, is different than the pink drug, right? Suspect versus authentic. So there are ways to check for, hey, are the drugs we're getting actual complying with the standards that were supposed to be met? Over here is an example. There was, I guess, back in the mid 2000s, there were some issues with some fake chips finding their way into the inventory, and how do we check and ensure that those things don't come into the inventory, especially if they're going to be used in high value systems like military systems or automobiles or or aircraft where there are potential losses of life associated with having a poor counterfeit item in the system. So this is a broad look at the various types of risks that many supply chains will face, and we'll go through these. We'll go through a few of these in a little detail, but one of the first that I just talked about was the loss due to counterfeiting or loss of intellectual property, dependence on suppliers, different visions, different cultures in terms of how they view things could impact your supply chain, loss of operational control, lower visibility and performance and quality, not having the insight to know if you're getting the right level of quality in your products, And then another one is loss of critical skills. Losing key members of your organization can significantly impact your supply chain as well. So let's talk about the different type of risks. We're going to categorize them broadly into 3 bins. First is kind of the what I call hazards, natural hazards. They could be random disruptions due to weather. They could also be malicious behavior, terrorism, product tampering, and theft. So we can kind of categorize those risks as hazard-related risks. There are also financial risks, both internal and external financial risk. You have your corporate financial risk within your own company, but you're also dependent on suppliers who may have financial risk associated with their companies. And if their companies have a high level of risk associated with them, you need to know that and account for that within your supply chain, because if they have issues where they're no longer able to perform, it will significantly impact your performance as you move forward. And then the last is your operational risk, which is the internal risk that the organization can usually control, both internal and external quality. Late deliveries, poorly managed inventory are examples of operational risks that create problems for you. So Schlegel and Trent create the what they call the supply chain management house here. They have 4 pillars. You have supply risk, you have process risk, you have demand risk, and then you have environmental risk. And you need to be able to manage across all 4 of those if you really want to have an effective supply chain risk management strategy for your organization. This is a chart that comes out of Schlegel and Trent, and what they're looking at here is companies that have a supply chain risk management policy in place. They've adopted a supply chain risk management strategies. And what they find is companies with high level of maturity, right, they've adopted a supply chain risk management strategy, have 50% less stock volatility, which makes sense based on what we saw before. If you have a good risk management plan and your supply chain and organization is robust to disruptions, you're not going to see much change in your stock volatilities. And they also found that leaders achieve almost 95% better accuracy of cash flow forecasts when they have a strong supply chain risk management strategy in place. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we move forward. So what are the supply chain risk management enablers? What are the things that an organization should be doing to enable them to effectively manage risk within their supply chain? So the first is to have a supportive organizational design. And we're going to talk about a few of these in a little more detail, but you need to have an organization that supports your strategy in terms of managing risk and managing your supply chain. So if we come over here, one of the key elements is what's commonly called in supply chain management collaborative planning, forecasting, and replenishment, or CPFR. And the CPFR process is you go through a period of strategy and planning where you've got some collaboration amongst all the members of your supply chain. Ideally, you create some form of a joint business plan. You jointly do sales forecasting, order planning forecasting. You execute on those, do order generation fulfillment, and then you assess performance. And you do that both at the manufacturing level and the retailing level so that you can meet the demands of your customers. So having a good CPFR process in place helps make it more effective or efficient for you to do good supply chain risk management. If you have a good process in place on how to plan and strategize as well as forecast and respond. Is having a key executive responsible for the entire supply chain. So having some form of a vice president of supply chain management who has executive authority over the 2 key elements, demand planning and supply planning, across your entire supply chain, from your lower level suppliers to your producers, distributors, and eventually your customers. They need to be responsible for the entire global sourcing, responsible for demand and finished good inventory planning, And they lead the supply chain risk management initiatives throughout all phases of the supply chain. So you need somebody who's an advocate for helping identify the risks and managing the risks and the initiatives that are being put in place to help reduce them. Usually a lot of that's done through a variety of organizational teams. I've got a set of teams that's common to hear that you see out there in organizations: value analysis, value engineering teams, new product development teams, customer relationship teams, sourcing teams, supplier, creating a buyer-supplier cycle. But you need some method to really engage within the organization to help you build this collaborative model so you can do strategy and planning and make that effective to help you do a better job at understanding the demand and providing the materials. So those increase your ability to do better demand planning and supply planning. And then today, information technology, as we all know, has been changing rapidly. Over here on the left side, I've got kind of the supply chain cycle in terms of electronic data interchange, right? So somebody creates a purchase order, there's a purchase order response in EDI, electronic data interchange 855. Then there'll be some advanced ship notice, which is a electronic data interchange 856. It creates an invoice, and then once the invoice is created, there's a remittance of the invoice. So that's kind of how, from an information perspective, the supply chain works in terms of interacting between the supplier and the customer. This is changing rapidly. There's other technology out there that are changing the supply chain, especially in terms of our ability to have visibility into what's going on in the supply chain. The newer technologies, RFID technologies, certainly having an impact on that. And because we have these items out there, these Internet of Things, right? These things that can provide information through the internet, we have much more information, and this increase in information and visibility will help enable us to improve the flow of our products through the system and help us optimize our supply chain from supplier all the way to the end of customer. So the goal is better information flow. Having more information will help us make better decisions, which in turn will help us have better cash flow in the supply chain. Now, blockchain is kind of the new hot technology out there. And what blockchain is it's a way for different parts of the supply chain to communicate and share information with each other. And what's nice about blockchain is you can also transfer currency between participants. Blockchains can be both public or private. And in a blockchain, every member can read the information that's been submitted. The blockchain has three key elements: decentralization, transparency, and immutability. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each of those. So when we talk about decentralization, we're creating this notion of a distributed ledger where each user has a copy of the ledger and participates in confirming transactions independently. We can have it where that's anonymous, so you don't know who those individuals are, or where they're not anonymous, right? Permissions required for users to have a copy of the ledger. But we want to get away from this one centralized node to having a decentralized type look, and blockchain enables us to do that pretty quickly. The other is this notion of transparency. Actually, blockchain provides both privacy and transparency. So you will be able to see all transactions that are done by your public address, but people won't know your private identity, which is secure. So this is just an example of a transaction, so you can see who the transactor was from and to. But these codes, people don't know who they are, but they do know what the transaction was and what the value of the transaction was. And this is for an Ethereum example for currency. And then the last piece is immutability. Once entered in the blockchains, the transaction cannot be changed, which is very important and one of the key attributes associated with blockchains. What they do is they use what's called a cryptographic hash function to enable transactions to take place. And this hash function creates what they call an avalanche effect, where small changes in your input results in significant changes in the hash. So if you look here, the text, this is a test, where you begin the sentence with a capital T, might have a hash that looks like this. If we put in the same text, except we don't use a capital T, we have a completely different hash. So it adds some immutability and some privacy to the interactions within the block. One of the implications for supply chain is this notion of smart contracts. So now you can create contracts with all of your vendors that are part of your supply chain, and you can each see each other's transactions, and there's complete and total transparency of when things take place, and that can't be changed. The advances in the sharing economy, things like Uber and other sharing type businesses, what you can do now is you can eliminate the middleman. You can go direct between parties. So if you're using a blockchain between an individual and the individual driver, you might be able to think about taking out the middleman. Crowdfunding is another place where blockchain is being used. Crowdsource venture capital funds. Auditing, again, this notion of time stamping of date and location makes auditing much easier of your supply chain process. Other places where people are looking is protection of intellectual property, identity management, as well as Internet of Things. So all of those things have implications from using blockchain. So blockchain is a technology that's on the horizon that will have significant impact on the supply chain, and will help maybe reduce significant risks associated with the supply chain. For example, one of them could be associated with supply chain counterfeit items moving through a supply chain. You'll be able to find out where they came in and where they came from, and be able to trace it all back. When we talk about risk, we have to have a risk measurement system within an organization. Here's just a few that some companies use. One is when they're working in a global environment, they might look at a risk indice for a country where they might be sourcing materials. There's a country risk index that's out there. Then there's a total cost to manage risk, both total landed cost and life cycle cost models. You want to incorporate risk into both of those. There are what we call value at risk models that are out there that you can use, or CVAR, conditional value at risk models, to help assess the impact of risk on your performance. And then we already talked briefly about the risk exposure index as a measure to see what you're up against for your current strategy or supply chain. Last enabler they talked about is this notion of talent management. Talent is critical to your supply chain. Especially in today's environment, the demand for talent is high. The unemployment rate is low, and the demand for talent in in the supply chain area, especially in the area where we're asking people to do stuff with data. So in the data analytics area, there's an extreme shortage of folks. So recruiting talent and getting the necessary talent is important to help your organization, help you manage risk. So acquiring, there are a variety of ways to acquire talent, and there are a variety of ways to develop and retain your talent once you get it. But talent is a critical component of your supply chain risk management strategy. These are just some additional financial risks. There's an associated set of ratios that are associated with many companies with regards to liquidity, activity, how leveraged they are, and how profitable they are, and you might want to take those into consideration as you're looking to make partnerships with a variety of organizations. And then the last one we talked about was operational risk. So you have internal to your local firm, or the operational risk. External is your supply chain risks, but they impact your local. And then there are demand risks, right? They're internal to the supply chain, but it impacts not only suppliers, but your operational levels. And then the ones we really can't control are the external ones, both environmental, geopolitical, economic, and technological, right? So from the environmental, we talked about extreme weather, natural disasters, even pandemics. Geopolitical, we're seeing some of that now with trade restrictions, terrorism, piracy, theft, and illicit trade. And then economics, currency fluctuations, border delays, energy shortages all have an impact on elements of your supply chain. So how do we assess those risks and plan against those risks? The last item I wanted to talk about here is this notion of counterfeits, just to show you how big a problem counterfeit goods are. In the United States, this is data based on 2014, I believe. The United States, there were over $225 billion worth of counterfeit goods in the U.S., 75 billion in Mexico, 30 billion in Canada. And then the categories in which the counterfeits take place is drugs is the leader, over 200 billion, the cost associated with counterfeit drugs. Electronics is second, and then you can see software is third, and see a variety of other. The shoes and the clothing. Music is a relatively high one. So you can see what the impact of counterfeits are. So having the ability to manage and protect your supply chain against counterfeits is also important. So how do we do that? Well, there's a variety of what we call enterprise risk management frameworks. This is one called the COSO-Price-Waterhouse. COSO stands for the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations that are a thought leadership group that provides guidance on internal control, enterprise risk management, and fraud deterrence. Roughly 22% of the companies out there in the manufacturing and retail environment utilize an ERM framework. And so you can see the elements we talked about: understanding the internal environment, know what your risk appetite is, understand what the risk management philosophy is going to be, set your objectives, then go ahead and identify the events, look at the risk versus the opportunities, do the formal assessment and calculate and find out where you are in the red, yellow, green chart, where you look at likelihood versus consequence. And then what's your response to those risks once you identify them? You're going to try and avoid them, accept them, reduce them, share them. How do you control them? Build policies and procedures. And then you need to monitor those risks. So that's COSO. And then there's supply chain security management, ISO 28000 series, which provides best practices for security assessment plans. Development of resilience is 2802. 2803 is audit and certification. So there's some international standards out there, and roughly 23% of manufacturers and supply chain organizations are utilizing or making use of some of the ISO series documents, which help increase and reduce the risk associated with their supply chain. And then at the other end of the scale, there's roughly 26% that do not follow a specification standard or a framework when it comes to risk. So they have no formal risk management plans out there. For those types of companies, they probably need to begin to look at that, and there are ways they can get engaged and learn about risk management. APEX, which is the Association for Operations Management, provides some certification related to risk management. This just gives you kind of an overview of the APEX Risk Management Education Certificate, the types of things they cover: basics of risk management, business continuity planning, assessing risks, enterprise resource framework, governance and risk compliance, controlling risk, and then how it impacts your supply chain, and some additional modules out there. So today, we're all aware of this notion of big data and how big data is impacting our supply chains. When we talk about big data, we talk about volume, velocity, and variability. The advent of new technology and sensors is increasing the volume and the rate at which we receive information, and also increasing the variability in the type of information. So we have structured data, which is kind of our transactional time phase data. We have unstructured data, which is things like social data, customer service, warranty information. There's the sensor data, the RFID, the QR codes, maybe temperature sensors on trucks. And then there's some additional new data types. We might have video, voice, digital images that provide information for us. And how do we incorporate that into our supply chains to help us manage our supply chains more effectively and help us reduce risk? Well, one of the future areas is this notion of supply chain analytics, right? Analytics is no longer a nice to have, but becoming a necessary component. When we talk about analytics, we're talking about four main areas. There's what we call descriptive analytics, where we try and characterize what's happened or what is happening associated with our current system or supply chain that we're studying. Diagnostic analytics, when we've had a problem, we're trying to find out why did it happen. So we're using a variety of tools, building upon that large increase in data to help us diagnose. Then when we make changes, we'd like to do what's called predictive analytics, so we can predict what will happen. And finally, how can we make it happen? That's where we use prescriptive analytics, right? So we're taking information and we're using it to help us optimize our system. And part of this is dealing with risk and uncertainty as we move through these four steps in the analytics hierarchy there. So when we talk about supply chain risk management future directions, companies' attitudes towards risk need to shift. They need to understand what their risk levels and tolerance are going to be. They need to move beyond just having tier one suppliers. They also should be considering establishing risk metrics, which stress real-time predictive indicators, because they're going to have access to more real-time data. A lot of places are seeing homegrown tools replaced by third-party tools, so they need to understand what the implications of that are. And then a lot of risk approaches will rely on anticipation rather than reaction. So a lot of folks are just in the reaction mode, but if you can make use of some of these predictive analytics tools, it can enable you to do some things using prescriptive analytics so that you can anticipate versus react to problems. And my last slide here, this is a recent slide, a 2019 slide that was put out by DHL, and it talks about the top 10 supply chain risk trends to watch for in 2019. First is the trade wars, their impact on the manufacturing network. The second one is the rising demand and fragile supply create critical raw material shortages. So again, dealing with the leanness of your supply chain. Recalls and safety scares may put some quality under scrutiny. Climate change impact is number 4. Economic uncertainty is number 6. The environment impact and regulations may have an impact on the transportation sector as well as the manufacturing sector. Cargo, because we're a global company, cargo may get caught up in industrial unrest, right? As you're trying to move stuff between ports, if you have issues with relationships with various countries in the global context, it may slow down things. Hazardous transport, I guess there's been a series of hazardous transport container ship fires, so they identify that as a risk. And then number 10 has to do with drones strike a blow to aviation safety. So the use of drones is creating some concern about risk when it comes to aviation, and that may have an impact on supply chain. And number 9 here is the battles at the border are increasing wait times, both at the US-Mexico and the EU-UK lines may create increases in transportation delay, which create problems for your supply chain. So with that, I'm going to stop, and hopefully you get a high-level view of what supply chain risk is, what are some supply chain risk management strategies and enablers, and have a little bit of idea about what's coming down the road. So I'll open it up to questions.
And if you have a question at this time, please just type it in the chat box over on the bottom right-hand side of the screen. You should see a little menu that allows you to access the chat box. So please just type your questions there. And in the meantime, while you formulate your questions, I'll tell you a little bit more about, I'll skip over a few of these, tell you a little bit more about the Master of Science in Operations Management degree program and the graduate certificate in project management that I didn't actually mention before. So both of these programs can be completed 100% online, or you can take classes here on the Fayetteville campus if you're interested in doing that. But you'll see kind of some of the highlights here. Very affordable programs, very flexible schedule, and there is a GRE waiver available if that is something that you're interested in. You can always ask me about that as well. So are there any questions for Dr. Pohl? We'll kind of hang around for about 5 more minutes in case anyone does have questions. Just to let everyone know, we do have one more webinar in our series. It'll be the last one of this year's series, and it is on April 25th. So mark your calendar there. It is an engineered approach to site selection, determining where facilities should be located. A lot of that has to do with kind of, again, with the supply chain and trucking there. Today's webinar is recorded, and so the video will be posted to our website within about a week, and then registration for next month's webinar will open early next week, probably Monday or Tuesday, and you'll also find that on our website. Other questions? It looks like someone is typing one. And we will wait for the question. Okay, she just says, thanks so much for doing this. She missed the first 20 minutes. Will recording be available? Yes. So again, the recording will be available and it'll be posted to our website within about a week. It usually takes about a week to get the video up, but absolutely. It will be posted and linked to this session on the website. Yes. And you can also view other previous webinars. If you see a title that you're interested in, you can kind of go back and watch all of the previous webinars there as well. And again, you have my email address here, so if any other questions do come up for me about the program or for Dr. Pohl about what he talked about today, please feel free to send me an email and I'll make sure that we get your questions answered. So with that, thank you all for attending, and I hope you all have a great rest of the afternoon.